welcome to another Garden City Arts online program. My name is Katie Guthrie and I'm going to be your instructor for the day. Today you are watching a painting tutorial video. Now, this segment that you are enjoying right now is kind of the introduction to the beginner video where I tell you about all the materials you need to have. So if you've already watched this once, no worries. I'm sorry you have to hear it again. You can just fast forward. The segment is about 5 minutes long, so just jump forward in the video and you can get to painting. Now, if you haven't watched it before, we're gonna talk about supplies. Really fast, let's talk about brushes. It might surprise you, you really don't need a lot of brushes when you are making a painting. Sometimes I only use one brush the entire time. So keep in mind you don't have to go out and buy like a really big set. There's only really 3 brushes that I would recommend you to go ahead and get or have on hand. I'm gonna hold them up close so you can see. The first is the wash brush, and the wash brush is very thick. It holds a lot of water, and it is generally a pretty big brush. It's great for covering in areas. So you'll want to have a wash brush. You don't have to have a 1-inch wash brush like this one that I'm showing you. You could get away with doing like a 5/8 or a 1/2-inch wash brush. That's absolutely fine. Shader brush. This guy is absolutely essential to have. This is a number 6 shader. As long as you have something close to a number 6, you are good. I wouldn't go as small as a number 4 or number 2. I would keep with 6 or an 8 shader brush. You'll notice it looks very similar to the wash brush, except it doesn't have quite as many bristles, so it's not as absorbent. It doesn't retain as much water, and it is really great for working in detail. So shader brush is absolutely essential. Make sure you have this guy. The round brush, you can take him or leave him. He's not my favorite brush, but he is kind of important sometimes. So the round brush has kind of a point like a pencil, and this guy is a number 4 round brush. I would stick with something around there. You could get a smaller round brush, that's absolutely fine. They're kind of difficult to use the smaller they get, so keep that in mind. So you'll want to have a wash brush, a shader brush, and a round brush. Of any size, whatever works. This is kind of the theme of all of these online courses, whatever works. Next, you'll want to have some chalk on hand. Chalk, like chalk pastels, basically, is a tool that is absolutely essential for painters. This is something that we use to draw, and it's easily erasable. It also kind of disappears behind paint, so it's a great tool to have. I would suggest having chalk of various colors: white, orange, blue, just because it depends on the canvas that you're working on. Sometimes white doesn't show up, so it's good to have different colors. If you can't find any chalk, if you don't have any on hand, it's okay to use a pencil. Again, the theme is whatever works. We're making it work to get some art made. But pencils are not the best because graphite shows through paint after a while, and also it's harder to erase on your canvas. You might have little pencil marks left behind. So I don't recommend it, but you can use a pencil if you have to. The other things that are absolutely essential to have for this upcoming class is to have a container to wash out your brushes. Okay, it can be anything, old tuna cans, cat cans, whatever. You'll want to have lots of paper towels. Most people go through quite a few. And then you'll also want to have a surface to paint on. Now, you need to have your surface primed in the color that we told you to do. So sometimes we start with red backgrounds, tan backgrounds, blue backgrounds, what have you. You need to have your canvas already painted that color. The reason for that is that the way I teach these videos, we start on a colored ground surface to kind of help us out to save some time. So it's absolutely important that you have that done in advance before you start the video. As far as painting surfaces go, really you could use just about anything. If you really want to paint and you don't have a canvas, no stress. You could use something as simple as cardboard. Just keep in mind that it's not meant to be painted on, so you're gonna run into some issues. It's gonna be kind of difficult. It's also gonna be very absorbent, so you'll want to have like maybe 2 layers of paint laid on there so that it's not soaking in or sucking up the paint. You could use like a cover on a book, an old book that you're not using anymore, rip it off and paint on that. You could use acrylic paper. They do make paper that is thick enough to take heavy-bodied acrylic paint. Not the best options, but they do work. If you have a bunch of stretched canvases at home, this is definitely the way to go. It's going to be archival, which means it'll last longer and you'll be happier with it in the end. So, paintbrushes, miscellaneous tools, your surface. Let's talk about paint now. I would recommend having a heavy-bodied acrylic paint. Heavy-bodied basically means that it's heavier. The pigmentation is denser, so it's not quite as runny and it's not as light in color as some of your craft paints that you get like at like a craft store or Walmart or something like that. So heavy-bodied acrylic paints would be my recommendation. Master's Touch, Liquitex are 2 brands that you can get at Hobby Lobby. If you really need one, you can go there. Those aren't my favorite brands, to be honest. Dick Blick is an online art store, and they have really good, reasonably priced paint. It's the Studio Dick Blick brand that I really like and that we use at the gallery all of the time. Color-wise, just depends on the painting you're doing, but I recommend having a cadmium red medium hue, cadmium yellow medium hue, cerulean blue, an ultramarine blue, a quinacridone, which is basically a fancy word for magenta, and the last 2 I'd recommend would be your titanium white and your Mars black. You can get away with just having those 7 colors and mixing those. I rarely buy secondary colors unless it's absolutely essential. Another one that you could have on hand if you are willing to buy extra paint would be burnt sienna. That would be a really good one to have as well, and that's a brown. So that concludes my little introduction on supplies. I will get into like teaching you the basics of painting in the video. So I hope you have a wonderful time. Sit back and relax, and I hope this is a good de-stressor for you. Have fun! Hello everyone, and welcome to the very first session of Canvas+Paint online. So we are painting a really fun scene today. It's a sunset setting over a lake with swans swimming. I'm going to show you how to recreate that painting step by step. So before we get started on the painting, let's talk about our tools. Our tools are very important. So never leave dirty brushes heavy with paint on your table. Always wash them out as you go, and never leave your paintbrushes in water just sitting there. Also bad for your brushes. These tools are what help you create your painting. If you don't take care of your tools, you're not going to have a good painting. So keep that in mind. Another thing you want to do is to prime your brush before you use it. So we never use dry brushes on our composition unless we're going for like texture or something like that. We always prime our brush. So I take my brush, dip it in paint water, and tap it on the rim of the can, and then pat it dry. Okay. The goal is to have a damp brush that leaves a little bit of a trace of water on the palm of your hand. But if it drips on the palm of your hand and you have like a giant pool, nope, go back to the paper towel, pat it dry. You want only a little bit of damp water coming from your brush, or a damp brush and not very much water coming from your brush. Sorry. Next, let's quickly talk about how to clean out our brushes properly. That way we can don't have to stop and talk about that later. So if your brush is thick and heavy with paint, I wipe it off on my palette as much as possible, or on my painting, and then I take my brush, swirl it in the paint water, tap it on the rim of the can, and pat it dry. So swirl, tap, and when you do that, push against the rim of the can to get all that extra water out of your brush, and pat it dry. And you'll have a clean, happy brush that's ready to move on. So speaking of moving on, let's go. So the first thing we need to do is to get our color mixed for the first step. We're working from the background to the foreground. So like the sky, lake, trees would be that order. Background would be the sky, midground would be our lake, and foreground would be our trees. We're going to work from the top to the bottom. It's just a good rule of thumb to get into. And so we need to mix up 2 colors very quickly. I'm going to take about a pea-sized amount of yellow paint and put it on my palette. I have all of the colors that we need for this painting laid out that I'm going to mix together to make all the other colors that we need. You don't have to have such big piles of paint. I just did that so I wouldn't have to stop the video to grab some. Now, red is a dominant color, so when you mix it in, you don't use very much. A little bit goes a very long way. It really changes the paint quickly. So I want kind of a medium orange. I might use just a tad bit more red, but again, it's always easier to add more paint rather than trying to fix the color that you don't like and that you're not happy with. You'll end up with a giant pile of paint that doesn't really work for anybody. Next, I'm going to make a darker version of red. So this is cadmium red hue that I'm using, and I'm using some cerulean blue. Again, a little bit goes a long way. I'm not really trying to make purple. I'm trying to make my red a little darker. So, oh boy, a little bit goes a really long way. Keep that in mind. I'm gonna have to grab more red, but that's okay. So, this is really dark red. I want a little bit of a brighter red. Now, you might be asking yourself, why isn't she using the black to make red darker? Well, I very rarely use black to make shades of colors. Instead, I use another color to darken the color. So I use blue to darken this red. It keeps the color more vibrant and more natural looking, where black will just really dull it down and make it look sad. We don't want sad colors. So I have my 2 colors that I need to get started. I am going to put in kind of a hint of sun at my horizon line, and I'm going to darken the edges in the tops and the bottoms to show that it's brightest in the middle and darker on the edges. So I'm going to start demonstrating that. I'm going to use my brush in 2 different ways. The first way is if I use the top of my brush and my brush is at its thinnest point going from left to right, that's going to make a line. If I want to fill in space, I'm going to turn my brush to its thickest point and move it from side to side, okay? Now, that looks decent, but if it's too heavy, what you do is you take water and mix it into your paint. That makes it more transparent, and it will allow more of the background to show through. So as I come down, I'm going to add more water to my paint to make it more transparent, so it blends in with the background a little bit easier. Notice how fast I'm going? It's not because I'm trying to show off or make it harder for you to learn. It's because you want to go fast. Don't overthink it, okay? Go big brush strokes back and forth. If I do little tiny ones, I'm going to have a whole bunch of little brush stroke lines popping up, and I don't want that. Now, I'm making it brightest right at the horizon line. Sorry, there's a really bad glare on on my end. It's not on your end, I checked. So it's difficult for me to see. So if you see me going back and forth and looking at my painting and picking it up, it's so that I know that I'm doing this right. Bear with me, please. Sorry. First online painting program ever. Things are definitely gonna be interesting. So I am going to make sure that I have a lot of water mixed into my paint so that I can have some really transparent washes. That's what happens. That's what it's called when you mix water into your paint, a wash or a glaze. Kind of towards the edges, and then right at that horizon line, that's where I'm allowing my paint to be thicker and more opaque and heavier and brighter. Now, I'm going to call that good for my lake. So here's my horizon line and everything below it's lake. Now, it's hard to visualize, but in the top part of my painting is going to be sky. I don't want to do the exact same thing down here that I did up here, but I do want to put in some hints of clouds. So I'm just putting in some thick chunky areas. I'm using the brush at its thinnest point for now. Putting in some chunky areas for clouds. And then I'm going to mix a little bit of water into my paint and soften some of the edges by going over it with my full brush. Okay, so I have a hint of sky and I have my lake. I'm gonna put just a little bit more down here. And now I'm going to swirl, tap, and dry my brush, and I'm going to worry about my corners, the edges of my canvas where the sky, where the sun is not touching them nearly as much as it is right here where it's setting. So it's brightest here, darker on the top and the bottom. So again, I'm going to make sure that I have water mixed into my paint. To mix water into your paint, you dip your paintbrush in water and mix it on the side of your paint palette. Okay, now that I have my brush nice and heavy with paint, I'm gonna come down here and grab a little bit more paint and darken these edges. Now, it might not seem like we're doing a whole bunch. It's not really having all that much impact, but if you work with little subtle layers, it's going to be more effective overall than if you do like really drastic things and bold moves right at the beginning. So we're adding these little touches, these little flares, to make the painting overall more appealing towards the end. It'll all pay off soon, is what I'm trying to say, in a very roundabout way. So I'm being thick and opaque with my paint right at the edges, and then once again, I'm going to take my paintbrush, mix more water in, and bring that more transparent paint down so it comes into contact with what I did with my yellow earlier. Okay, so sky done. I'm gonna come down here to my ground and darken it up even more. I really want a darker ground because it's farther away from my sunset, so it's gonna be darker. So really darkening the bottom. And then as I come away from the bottom, that's where I will add more transparent layers of paint. I can even put in like little chunks of area of darkness. And because we are painting water, I'm thinking about going side to side, and I'm thinking of like the way light reflects on water. Picks up like the little areas of ripples. Okay, and then I'm just gonna do one more quick transparent wash and done. So really soft and subtle. You'll notice that your yellow dried as we were painting the dark red, and it might be a little too subtle. If that is the case, you can always grab more paint, mix more paint if you have to. This is why I generally recommend people to mix more paint than what they think they need. That way they don't have to go back and mix more. Okay. Then I can do another layer on top. Again, I'm not being heavy-handed, but I am being mindful that when yellow dries, it dries very transparent, which will allow the red that we're painting on to show through, and sometimes show through a little too much. Okay, sorry for my squeaky chair. I have a squeaky chair in my studio that I'm sitting on, which is probably a bad idea. Gonna make for some funny moments in the video. Okay, so I have my sunset done for now, and I'm going to move on. I'm going to start incorporating more yellow hues and more light into my background. Sorry, into my sunset, the background, and then into the midground, the lake. So let's mix some more colors really fast. I'm going to grab a lot of yellow, like 3 or 4 peas of yellow. And I'm going to grab just a tinge of white. The reason I'm mixing a little bit of white into my cadmium medium yellow is because yellow is very transparent. Adding white to it will give it more of a body. It'll make it more opaque and make it a little bit thicker and heavier. So I'm mixing just a little bit of white and the smallest amount of red that you can possibly get on your palette knife, just to turn it slightly orange. Now, keep in mind, these are just the recommended colors. If you're like, ooh, I really like oranges and not so much yellows, then you can make yours more orangey, okay? That's absolutely fine. This is your painting. I'm just kind of your guide. Doesn't mean I'm your dictator. You get to choose what you do. Obviously, I can't like come to your house and dictate what you do. That would violate social distancing guidelines. So I have my yellow kind of ochre color mixed up. Now I'm going to go with very, very light yellow, and so I'm going to grab definitely more white and mix it in. So I'm using cadmium yellow, medium hue, and I like to use titanium white. Whatever white you have is just fine. Okay, so I have my two yellows mixed up, and now I am ready to start putting in my sunset. So if you need to, this is where the chalk comes in handy. If you need to, you can give yourself kind of a guide of where you want to put your sun. Okay, it's going to be a semicircle or a half circle that you put in. And it's up to you really how big you want it or how small you leave it, okay? That is my light source. So as I start working with my water, all of my light is going to be reflected from my light source onto my water. So I'm going to grab my wash brush. I might have to switch to a shader brush, and if you need to, that's absolutely fine to put in your circle. I'm going to make sure it's nice and damp, and then I'm going to throw in some of my first yellow. I'm probably going to have to build this up in layers because, again, yellow is very transparent. When you are adding in objects, it's a good idea to kind of go along the outline first and then fill it in. Okay, so I'm intentionally leaving one side a little bit brighter and the other side a little bit darker. So I'm adding my paint, concentrating it on the left side and kind of leaving the right side alone. Now, I know you probably are like, we're not done yet, but I'm going to let this first layer of paint dry, and then I'm going to come back to it. Acrylic paint is kind of frustrating sometimes because you have to let it dry and you have to work in layers. If you don't let your layers dry, if you just keep working and working and working, you end up overpainting and creating slick spots, areas where the paint will not stick to the canvas till it dries, and you end up taking paint off more so than putting it on. So be patient, let it dry. We'll start on our ripples and then come back to it and add more color. I always go from dark to light, so I'm using my darker of the two yellows, and then I will put in my lighter of the two yellows in. So here goes my ripples. I'm using my brush at its thinnest point. Make sure that you have a little bit of water mixed into your paint so that it's really fluid and easier to use. We're painting water and we want our brush nice and damp, but you don't want it pooling water. So get a good happy in between medium. So I'm putting in my brightest yellow. I'm putting a lot more in at the horizon line than what I might normally, just because I want a bit of a brighter painting. We need some light in our lives right now. And then as it comes away from my sun, I need to start thinking about creating some kind of a path that the water works its way down on. I cannot paint this whole chunk of water in yellow. That's not going to work, okay? So instead, I'm going to create kind of a pathway where you can see the sun is reflecting as it comes down on and away from the horizon line. And as it comes down, it gets smaller and smaller. So it starts really heavy and thick, and then as it comes down, I'm spacing it out and making it thinner until the light kind of dissipates and it's no longer being reflected onto the water because it's too far away. All right, so I have a sunset-ish. I'm going to put just a little bit more bright yellow in. Again, I feel like we could all use a little bit more light in our lives right now. Okay, when you get to the darker shadows of your lake, remember where we put in this darker version of red? Stop. You don't want any more light down there, okay? You've gone too far. You're done. So I have my first layer of yellow in. Now I'm going to go back in with my lighter version of yellow. My sun has almost dried, not completely, so I might have to be careful. And I'm going to go right along my outside, right along the outside of my sun, of my former line. And if you start noticing that you're picking up all of these little brush strokes, you might just have to stop. You might have to wait and let it dry and come back to it in a little bit. Again, acrylic paint kind of tests your patience sometimes. That's why a lot of painters like gouache or oil, because it does not test their patience nearly as much as acrylic does. Okay, so as I come over to the opposite side, you might have noticed I grabbed some water from my paint can and mixed some water in to make the paint a bit more transparent. The reason for that is that I want this side of my sun to be darker. I want this side to be brighter. So if I use transparent paint over here, it's going to allow the red to pop through. If I use less water and more paint, it's going to make it more opaque and not be see-through. Okay, so I have that done. Now I'm going to continue with my shader brush, and I'm going to put in little tiny hints of sun and light on my water. I'm mixing a little bit of water into my paint so that it's easier to glide. It doesn't fight me. What I mean by easier to glide is that it's easier to glide on the surface. It doesn't catch and fight. Okay. I'm not going to continue using my shader brush. You can if you want. I'm impatient. I'm whipping out the big guns. I'm whipping out my wash brush so that I can put it in faster and more effectively. Okay. All right. So this is a bit chunkier and heavier than what I would normally paint. Again, I wanted a little bit more light than normal. If you want to do more of the original, then you are going to use more glazes and less of the chunky thick paint that I'm using. So glazes, again, are when you mix water into your paint and water it down so it's transparent. If I don't like my chunkiness, I can take a clean damp brush and kind of soften my chunks by very lightly brushing over them. And do you see how it softens the edges a little bit? So now it's not so chunky, it's a little bit more soft, and it's more evenly distributed. Feel free to go back in and make changes and perfect. Just keep in mind that there is no edit undo button. There's no like control delete. You can't go back, okay? So if you're happy with what you have, maybe just say, I'm good, and move forward. Don't try to make it like even better, because sometimes that even better is an illusion. It's not real. you'll end up just having some super big problems that you've created for yourself and now have to problem solve on how to fix, and that's not fun. So keep in mind, sometimes it's good to just walk away and like know to move on and know that it's going to get better as we move on. So what I'm doing next is I'm going to take a little bit more white and mix it into my yellow, my light yellow, and I'm just going to go back in and add a bit more brilliance, so a little bit of a lighter yellow to my sun. Just to really make it pop. And then I can always do that to just little tiny chunks, little tiny lines of the ripples. And then done. Okay, I'm gonna stop messing with it. I'm gonna take my own advice and know that I need to just move on. And I am done with my sunset and my mid-ground, except for the swans. We'll do the swans kind of in a little bit. Next, I'm going to move on to black. We're going to start introducing some detail at the horizon line, and then we're going to work on the foreground. So, really fast, let's have a 101 on making lines on our palette. Crash course style. So, when you are making thin lines, like that of the variety that you see along the horizon line and at the foreground of the painting, of the finished product, you want to make sure that you have water mixed into your paint. It's very fluid paint that you're working with and not dry paint. So I dip my paintbrush in water and I mix it in a pile of paint off to the side. I don't mix it in the middle or else you're not going to accomplish anything. And then I swirl, tap, and dry my brush to get it nice and clean. I then control the amount of paint that's on my brush, okay? If you have a glob of paint, you're not going to get a nice clean line. So, control how much paint you grab, and then it's all about pressure and about the amount of paint you have on your brush. So, if I press hard, I'm going to have a thick, heavy line. If I press light, I'm going to have a much thinner line. So hard, heavy line, light, thin line. Now you'll notice that I'm holding my brush kind of perpendicular to my surface. That is sometimes easier because if you hold it more at like an acute angle to your surface, you are going to have a thicker line no matter what you do, especially when you're using a shader brush. You can use a round brush for this. I don't recommend it. Shader brush is the way to go, in my opinion. But test it out. Not on your painting, but somewhere else. Now, the more water you mix into your paint, the more transparent it's going to be. I want really light, kind of grayish weeds at the back, and I want it darker towards the front. So, along this horizon line, I can just come in and give myself a guide. I want weeds starting at the outside and stopping right about here. So from my ground that I just put in for myself, I'm going to put little weeds. And you can turn your brush to its thickest to kind of fill in the weeds, make it heavier at points. And then you can use your brush at its thinnest to create the weeds that kind of stick up. So I'm using pretty watered down paint to keep it pretty thin. But remember, you can always, I'm going below my line, you can always turn your brush to its thickest point to thicken up your area, and you can always go back and grab thicker, heavier paint with less water mixed into it if you feel like it's too light. Personally, for the background, I don't think there's any such thing as too light, especially because it's farther away, so we're not going to see it as crisp and cleanly as if we were closer to it, like with the foreground elements that we'll add in just a second. And let me just touch up my bottom, and there we go. So I have my weeds. So I was using my brush at its thinnest point, really pushing lightly, using very transparent layers of paint. I'm going to do the same thing to the other side, but I'm not going to do the exact same thing because that would be boring. In fact, if I look at my light source, I would say there's less weeds on this side and more on this side. So I'm going to come in and add a few more weeds over here. Do you see why I see that? Because do you see how the light is going this way? It's there's more light being reflected on this side than on this side. So that to me says that there's something blocking the light on this side. So I'm going to bring my weeds quite a bit ways over, all the way so that it's touching the sun. And then I'm going to make them a little bit taller to accommodate for this new clump of weeds. Painting is just a series of problem solving and just kind of a little bit of self-reflection. Taking a step back and checking out your painting every once in a while. Okay, and then I'm going to put them in over here. Remember, you can finger paint. You can lift paint up and take it off. So that actually brings up a really interesting point. If you ever need to erase, you take a clean, damp brush and you can erase the paint by scribbling at it back and forth and taking it off. If you do this while the paint is still wet, it will disappear. If the paint is dry, you're gonna have to paint over it. Paint covers paint, no stress. So there we go, I have my background. Now I'm going to move on to my foreground. So this was small little tiny detail, I was using a small brush. Foreground, it's bigger detail, I can go back to my big brush that I really like. So I'm going to go back to my wash brush and I'm going to grab some paint and I'm going to kind of imagine what my foreground's going to look like really fast by dotting in the tops of it. So I want it not to be flat and boring. I want it to be all different levels. And I want to make sure that I have some short areas kind of where I want people to start viewing the painting and feel like they can walk into it as if we were like Mary Poppins and we were creating a place where you could just walk into it. That's kind of what that path is made for. And then these sides are like the overgrown weeds that you find on the banks of rivers and lakes. So now that I know what I'm doing, I'm going to fill in. I'm using my brush and I'm going back and forth. Do you see this little motion that I'm making? Filling it in, making it nice and solid. I can turn my brush sideways if I need to kind of fill in, make it nice and chunky at the bottom. I'm going to use heavier, slightly thicker paint here because, at the bottom at least, because I want it to feel darker because it's closer to us. So darker on the bottom. And then as it comes out and becomes individual weeds and not just clumps of weeds, you want it to be more transparent. You want it to go back to that thinner, very transparent paint. Make sure you don't have any floating weeds. Ground those weeds. Okay, and then if you need to, thicken any areas up. And done. Okay, so we have our weeds put in, enough weeds to sustain us for now, and we are going to move on to putting in the trees. Now, trees can be difficult, especially for beginners. The good news is we are not doing the full tree. We are only doing the branches of the tree. So that makes life a little bit easier for us. We're going to imagine that the trunks of the trees are off of the painting, so we can't see them, but we can see some of their tree branches. When you are doing trees, I'm going to grab a canvas off screen and draw on it so you can see. When you're doing trees, you do not do perpendicular lines. That looks weird. Don't do that. So, if you end up with any of those, take your paintbrush and erase it off. This is another reason why we use chalk. It doesn't show up underneath the paint when we paint over it, and it erases like it's supposed to, unlike pencil. If we use pencil, it doesn't erase very well. So you want to think about using acute angles. Okay, acute angles are smaller than 90 degrees, so that would be like a perpendicular or a right angle, and we want to do like acute angles. Okay, and then you want to think about how to end your branches. They can fork and come off, break into different paths. Oftentimes they don't go straight up, they kind of come out and go wonky. So think about your branches being like that. Think about them coming out and breaking off. Make them like wiggle your hand if you need to make them look gnarly. And then I'm gonna put some over here to kind of capture the sun. So do you see how all of my branches are kind of pointing to the sun? I am directing the viewer to see what I want them to see when I want them to see it. That is the mark of a good composition, when you can tell the viewer what to look at and when. At least we can attempt to do that. Don't know if we always successfully do it. So I have my trees started. I'm going to quickly throw in my solid tree branches, and then we will build leaves off of those. So I use nice, fairly heavy paint. Still has some water mixed into it, and I'm using my wash brush. You can use your shader brush if you feel more comfortable. And I'm just going to branch out. Get it? Go branch out. Haha. Teacher pun. Art teachers are full of puns. And I'm probably going to stop at this point, because I may have overdone it on my branches. Another thing that you want to think about is where the branches connect. They are going to get heavier, not thinner. It needs to be thicker and heavier in the center of the tree, and then as it comes out, it gets thinner and more pointed. All right. I'm not sure if I'm happy with the placement of my branches, but do you know what? You can learn from my mistakes and not do as I do. And then I'm just going to have one over there. Okay, so I have my tree branches in. Now I can start adding my leaves. I really like painting leaves because they're fast and fun and you don't overthink them. I'm using my shader brush and I am doing a whole bunch of dotting motions. Now I'm starting with really thin transparent paint, just like we kind of did with the weeds. And then I can go back in with heavier paint and put heavier areas of paint where I want to thicken up and make the clusters of leaves a little bit bolder. So I'm going to do a whole bunch of this dotting motion. And again, my leaves are pretty transparent and thin right now. That's okay. They'll get heavier. Now I am focusing and concentrating kind of at the centers of my branches, but you need to branch out. Imagine that there's a million baby branches in here running around that you don't see that are creating clumps and clusters of leaves. If you only focus here, I'm going to show you on this side. If you only focus on the ends of your trees and nowhere else, and you don't branch out, they're going to look like poodle trees, okay? And it's not going to look right. So instead, you want to, again, use your imagination and pretend, ooh, there's maybe a baby branch coming off here. I'm going to put a weird cluster just kind of coming out of nowhere and fill this in a little bit. And there's definitely more branches off the painting, so I'm going to put more going off and more going off the top as well. And if you're like me and you're impatient, whip out the big guns. Pick up the wash brush and go a little faster. Are you bored watching me dot a whole bunch yet? I'm bored with me watching I'm bored with myself watching myself do a whole bunch of dotting. I bet you're bored. Okay, so I have my tree branches basically done on the first layer. Now I'm going to start whipping out my heavier paints, my chunkier paints. I still have a little bit of water mixed in, but not as much. And I am thickening little clusters. I'm not doing the whole thing. If I did the whole thing, we would have really heavy trees that didn't feel tree-like at all. You'll notice that I'm letting some little red windows pop through my trees. That is super important. Trees are not solid objects. They are made up of so many little tiny moving parts that oftentimes they have kind of a sense or a feel of transparency. So that's what I'm trying to achieve by doing a transparent layer of paint first, leaving some chunks of red popping through, and then coming back in and doing some dark areas. That is going to make for a far more effective tree. Don't be afraid to give your tree some tumors. Tumors and trees go hand in hand. And once you're happy with your trees, you can stop and call it good. Okay, so all of your chalk lines, keep in mind you can erase them. If they're really bothering you, you can erase them. I wouldn't recommend it until after you know everything is dry, because what might happen is that you might get into a little area of not quite dry paint, and then all of a sudden you have a black smear going across your tree. And smears and trees don't really go hand in hand, so don't do that. Instead, have a little bit of patience and wait, okay? Next, we are going to talk about the swans. I'm going to bring in my handy dandy example canvas really fast, and I'm going to demonstrate how to draw a swan. It is far easier than you might have thought. We don't have a cheat sheet today to draw the swan, but that's okay. We don't need one. So first, you're going to use a very basic oval. Now, you can always use my system that I teach with kids where I do a hill and then a bowl, and that's your oval. Then you want to think about adding a little triangle for the tail, okay? And then you want to think about creating, what I would do is do a little hook first, just to make sure that you have the right idea for your neck, you're happy with how it looks. Then you can go back in and thicken it up in parts. And at the very end, there's a little bit of a bump, and then it kind of comes to a point for where the swan's beak is, and that is your swan. When you fill it in, it will look more swan-like. I know with all of my little all of my little guidelines, it probably doesn't feel like a swan, but here, let me erase this, and there is a silhouette of a swan. Okay, now when you do this, you want to make sure that you have two swans facing each other. And before you do a whole bunch of details, you want to make sure you have them spaced right. And you want them to look like they're making a little heart with their necks. One can be a little bigger than the other. And then we will talk about, well, actually, let's just go for it. Let's do the reflection. So the reflection needs to kind of mirror what the swans are doing. So you're almost drawing like another swan in the water, except you want to think about not drawing the outside lines, but more drawing like scribbling what you think would be a swan without like a whole bunch of detail or form for the ripples. And I'll show you what that looks like more in paint as soon as I draw my swans on. As far as placement goes, make sure your background is dry first, or your midground, I should say, is dry first, and then you want to think about where to put the swans. So again, good compositions kind of tell the viewer what to look and where and when. There's a leading line right here, so I could put the swans right here and that would look really nice. I could go off of this branch and kind of see that it's pointing down and pointing at the swans right here. I think that's where I'm going to do it. But you could really just follow your lines in your paint that you've created. So if a branch is pointing down, that's a good place. If maybe this grass is pointing towards something, those are called leading lines, and they kind of direct the viewer's lines. They're implied, they're not actually there. Like there's not a line pointing to the swan, there's not like an arrow. It's just an implied line, okay? We all know that it's kind of pointing towards the direction of the swans. Sorry to go all art geek on you. My bad. Okay, so I'm going to quickly draw my swans. Again, just to recap on the swans, I start by drawing what kind of look like footballs or eyes. Then I'm going to do the next, blah. And that way I can make sure that I'm happy with how my swan's necks look and I have the right spacing. Then I can put in the tails. And then you just want to think about the start of your ripples or reflections. We'll talk about how to do those more in paint in just a little bit. Okay, it's not awful. Okay, now the round brush can be used for this. I'm going to use my shader brush, but I'm going to show you why the round brush is sometimes essential. It's good for making curvy lines, where the shader brush, it's a little bit more difficult. You have to be a bit more advanced to do a curvy line with a shader brush, and it takes more like twisting with your fingers. So I'm going to use my round brush for the curvy lines, and you want to push extremely light on a round brush, because if you don't, it makes a very thick, heavy line, and it can be difficult to control. So I'm going to do my outlines of my swans first. This is where you will probably need to erase at some point. So again, if you have a line that you're not happy with and you want to erase it, hit it as fast as you can, take a clean damp brush and use scribble back and forth, and you can erase that line. Okay, that's how you erase paint. Okay, so I'm going to finish quickly outlining my swans. You can get started on your swans if you want, so you don't have to watch me paint. It's kind of boring. Also keep in mind that the necks are probably thickest at the base, and then as they come away, they're going to get thinner and then get thick again for their head. Okay, swan 1 down. Keep in mind you need to make sure that you're mixing water into your paint. If you are not doing that, you are probably struggling. Water makes your paint more fluid and easier to use. This is really important. And sometimes when you do silly things, like I made the swan's head really big. So this is now going to be the male swan, and he is going to be a little bit bigger. I'm going to make his body bigger, I'm going to make his neck bigger. So sometimes when you do silly things, you just have to kind of go for it. Say, it is what it is. So I'm going to make his entire body a little bit thicker, make his body a little bit longer. just to accommodate for that massive head. That is not very graceful and swan-like. Okay, so I have my outlines. Now I can go back to my awesome shader brush and I can fill in my swan. So you want to fill in. After we get a solid swan, then we will talk about how to make the ripples. Guess what? We're going to use lots of water, transparent, layers, all that jazz, all the stuff we've been talking about. If you want to give your swans more details, like make them kind of ruffly, as if they have like feathers, you can. But keep in mind that these swans are being viewed from pretty far away, so don't get too detailed, is what I guess I'm trying to say. Keep it fairly simple. They're silhouettes after all. So I'm using less water in my paint and more paint because I am trying to create a more opaque layer. I might have to come back in and do another layer. I'm going to let it dry. Remember, that's kind of what you do with acrylic paint. You let it dry. Okay, I just realized, again, there's really heavy reflections on my canvas, so I can't really see what I'm doing. So I'm going to try to save this swan, who looks a little odd. Might be more of the ugly duckling and less swan at this point. Keep in mind, like, you don't have to paint flat. You can pick up your canvas and move it around like I'm doing. That's when you know I'm getting serious, is when I start rotating my canvas. Okay, so the swan is slightly better, still a little funky, but hey, no painting is perfect. Okay, so I have my swans done. Now I'm going to start mixing water back into my black paint, and I'm going to create transparent layers of paint. I'm going to mix a lot of water into my paint so that I can make a whole bunch of transparent layers of paint, because I want some ripples. So underneath my swan's bodies, I'm going to lightly put in these little ripples. You don't need a lot of them. Don't feel like you have to have your swan's reflection be as heavy and thick as your swan's body. No, it's not going to be. So I'm just creating the illusion of reflected water. And really fast, I just did something silly. Do you see how thick I made their neck? That's okay. Take your brush, swirl, tap, and dry, get a clean one, erase it, make it smaller. Make sure the reflections are kind of connected to their bodies, and then done. So you can make them look like they're kissing in the water, which is kind of cute. Or, you know, you don't have to do the love swans at all. You could just have like two swans staring away from each other. That's okay too. Whatever you want to do. So the silhouettes are done for my swans. I can go back in and do some touch-ups, give my swans another layer of opaque paint so that they don't have little red spots showing through. I might do that after the video when you're not being forced to watch me take care of all my mistakes. And instead I'm going to turn my attention to the very last step, which is to add blue into the trees and the weeds. We are ignoring the horizon line. That doesn't get any blue. The reason we're doing this is so that it's not just kind of an all warm colored painting. We're doing this to add just a touch more color. It really does pay off. It makes everything pop. It looks a little bit more interesting and dynamic. So I'm going to show you how to mix your blue now. I don't think I mentioned this at the beginning of the video, but I'm using a palette knife to mix my colors, and that just keeps my brushes nice and clean so I don't have to constantly clean them off. And I'm going to take a little bit of white and mix it into my blue to make it a little bit lighter. And then we're going to mute the color because that is very vibrant, which is okay for one of the two colors that we need. But the other color, I'm going to mute it and make it more meh by mixing some black into it. It really dilutes the color and it really tones it down, dials it back. And the reason I'm making this color is so that the color doesn't feel like it's sitting on top of the trees and my weeds. It feels like it's more grounded. Okay, so I'm going to use the meh muted color first. I'm going to use my shader brush and I'm going to grab just a little bit of it and I'm going to put it in my weeds, kind of the tops of my weeds. Notice I'm making some pretty thin lines. You don't want it to be super thick and heavy. It's meant to be kind of like the detail on top of your weeds. It can come fairly far down if you want it to, but I'm going to keep it pretty high, except where I want my viewer to look, which is in the pathway right here. By adding just a little bit more color, it just makes it far more interesting. It's not a boring black silhouette anymore. Okay, so I want to do this to the trees as well, but first I want to show you how to put the color back in on top because I feel like the color really just completes it and makes it even better. I mixed a little bit too much white into my color, so I'm going to mix a little bit more cerulean blue so it's not quite so bright. There we go. And I'm just going to put a little bit of pops of color into my weeds. Definitely more where I want the viewer to look. And there you go. That's all you do. And that just makes your black area look a lot more vibrant and interesting. Now, we were doing a whole bunch of straight lines for our weeds. Just gonna put a few more in. We were doing a whole bunch of straight lines for our weeds, but up in the trees, we're not doing straight lines. We're doing little tiny dots. I'm using the very corner of my shade brush, and I'm gonna kind of focus this on the black parts, wherever it's thickest on my trees. I can put maybe a few in the more transparent parts, but it wouldn't make as much sense. And I'm also putting it mainly where the light would be touching the trees, so not on the side edges, but right around where my sunset is. Okay, so we're thinking about light and where it would touch our trees and how it would touch our trees. Probably on the bottoms of the branches, closest to the sun. Okay, now I can always go back in if I feel like that's just a little too heavy, and I can dilute it, dial it back by taking a clean damp brush and kind of softening it up a little bit. Then I'm going to take my bright blue color and put in just little pops or touches of this. The very last thing that you can think about doing is maybe doing just a little teeny tiny reflection on your swan. If you're happy with your swans, if you like them, you could do this. If you're not happy with your swans, maybe don't do this. I would just be doing it to the tops of their heads and along the backs of their bodies. Round brush might be easier to do that. Okay, so there you have it. The painting is finished. The only thing that I need to do would be to wipe away my extra chalk lines. Now again, I would wait until you know your painting is dry. That way you don't hit any unexpected pockets or areas of wet paint and get like a giant black smear. I'm trying really hard not to smear my painting as I'm talking. And I hope you had a really fun time painting this painting. If you have any questions, please remember to comment on the video. I'll be happy to assist as much as I can. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend, and I will see you again soon, I hope.